There is perhaps no period in modern Korean history that remains as controversial, painful, and deeply remembered as the Japanese colonial era. In 1910, Korea, once the Joseon dynasty and later the Korean Empire, was formally annexed by the Empire of Japan. Over the next 35 years, Japan would reshape nearly every aspect of Korean society. Political power was stripped away, the economy was brought under Japanese control, Korean language, culture, and history were suppressed. For many Koreans, it felt as if their nation itself was being erased. Some chose to cooperate with the colonial government. Others believed resistance was impossible, but many refused to accept Japanese rule. They came from every walk of life. Some were soldiers. Others were students. Some were farmers. One was a hunter. One was barely more than a child. Each chose a different path, but all shared the same goal: the independence of Korea. Today we're asking the question, who were Korea's independence fighters? On the morning of October 26, 1909, a crowd gathered at a railway station in Harbin, China. Among the officials, soldiers, and spectators stood a Korean man waiting quietly. His name was Jung-geun. For years he had watched his homeland fall under Japanese domination. He had witnessed Korea lose its sovereignty, seen Emperor Gojong forced from power, and watched Japanese influence tighten its grip on the peninsula. What had begun as political pressure was becoming outright control. An was not born a revolutionary. As a young man, he ran a business and became a devout Catholic after taking refuge with French missionaries. But as Korea's situation deteriorated, he became increasingly involved in the independence movement. He abandoned his business and devoted himself to educating Koreans through schools he established in the north. Eventually, education alone no longer felt enough. Exiling himself to Vladivostok, Russia, An joined armed resistance groups fighting against Japanese influence. There he rose through the ranks and became a leader among Korean independence fighters. According to a famous account, he and several fellow activists cut off the first joint of their fingers and signed a pledge in blood, promising to dedicate themselves to Korea's liberation. Their greatest enemy was a man named Ito Hirobumi. As Japan's former prime minister and resident general of Korea, Ito was one of the principal architects of Japan's control over Korea. To many Korean nationalists, he symbolized everything that had gone wrong. When An learned that Ito would be passing through Harbin, he saw an opportunity. As Ito stepped onto the station platform, An approached and fired. The shots echoed across the station. Ito Hirobumi collapsed. Witnesses reported that An shouted, "Long live Korean independence," as he was arrested. During his interrogation, he showed little concern for his own fate. Instead, he focused on what he saw as Ito's crimes against Korea, listing 15 accusations that ranged from undermining Korean sovereignty to involvement in the downfall of the Korean monarchy. Japan sentenced him to death. On March 26, 1910, dressed in traditional white Korean clothing sent by his mother, An Jung-geun was executed by hanging. Just months later, Korea itself would be formally annexed by Japan. But An's death ensured that resistance would not die with him. Not every independence fighter remembered a free Korea. Bong-gil was born in 1908, only 2 years before annexation. Unlike An Jung-geun, he grew up knowing only colonial rule. Even as a child, he became critical of the Japanese-controlled education system. Rather than accepting it, he dedicated himself to educating ordinary Koreans. He organized literacy programs, promoted rural development, and encouraged farming communities to preserve their identity and dignity under colonial rule. Yet the deeper he became involved, the more dangerous his work appeared to Japanese authorities. Eventually, Yoon left Korea and traveled through Manchuria before arriving in Shanghai, where many leaders of the Korean independence movement had gathered in exile. There he met Kim Gu and other influential activists. Yoon took an oath that left little doubt about his intentions. He pledged to fight for Korea's independence and freedom, even at the cost of his own life. That opportunity came in 1932. Japanese forces had recently secured major victories in Shanghai and planned a large celebration attended by military commanders and government officials. To the Japanese, it was a victory ceremony. To Koreans and Chinese resistance groups, it was an opportunity. Disguised among the crowd, Bong-gil entered the event carrying an improvised bomb. When the moment came, he threw it directly into the gathering of Japanese leaders. The explosion killed and wounded several high-ranking officials and shocked the Japanese Empire. He was arrested, transported to Japan, and executed by firing squad later that year. He was only 24 years old. Yet his actions reverberated far beyond Korea. Even Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek reportedly expressed admiration for Yoon's courage, and the bombing elevated the Korean independence movement onto the international stage. If Jung-geun became famous for a single act, Jajin became famous for winning battles. Born into a noble Yangban family during the final years of Joseon, Kim's future seemed destined to follow a traditional path. But even as a young man, he displayed ideas that were considered radical for his time. At just 18 years old, he freed all of the slaves owned by his family and redistributed much of his land to former slave families. Such actions were almost unheard of in Korea's rigid social hierarchy. The decision cost him dearly and contributed to his imprisonment for several years. But Kim's attention soon turned to a much larger issue. In 1905, he joined the Korean Imperial Army. Only 2 years later, following Japan's increasing control over Korea, the army was dissolved. Like many former soldiers, Kim was left with a choice: accept the new reality or continue fighting. He chose to fight. After moving to Manchuria, Kim dedicated himself to building a professional resistance force. Drawing on his military training and connections inside Korea, he helped establish the Northern Military Administration Office and trained hundreds of independence fighters. For years, Korean resistance groups carried out operations along the border, frustrating Japanese authorities. Eventually, Japan decided to eliminate them once and for all. In 1920, Japanese forces launched a major campaign into Manchuria. Kim knew they were coming. Rather than waiting to be destroyed, he prepared his forces for battle in the forests around Cheongsan. The Japanese expected a swift victory. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance. For 6 days, Korean independence fighters fought against a larger and better equipped enemy. Using their knowledge of the terrain and careful planning, Kim and his men repeatedly struck Japanese forces. When the fighting ended, the Battle of Cheongsan had become one of the most celebrated victories in the history of the Korean independence movement. Almost overnight, Kim Jajin became a national hero. But victory did not bring independence. The resistance remained divided among numerous groups and ideologies. Determined to strengthen the movement, Kim worked to unite various organizations while helping establish new political and military institutions throughout Manchuria. Interestingly, despite his military reputation, Kim became increasingly attracted to anarchist ideas. He envisioned a Korea built not only on independence, but on local self-government and cooperation among ordinary people. For a brief period, some of these ideas became reality as Korean communities in Manchuria established their own schools, administrations, and security forces. But their success attracted powerful enemies. By 1930, multiple governments and political factions viewed the growing Korean movement as a threat. That January, Kim Jajin was assassinated by a member of the Korean Communist Party. He never lived to see Korea liberated. Yet the military structures, organizations, and networks he helped build continued fighting long after his death. Not every independence fighter came from the military or the aristocracy. Some came from the mountains. Before he became a legendary commander, Beom-do was a hunter. For years, he survived by hunting in the forests of northern Korea. His rifle was not a political symbol, it was his livelihood. Then Japanese authorities ordered Korean hunters to surrender their firearms. To many, it was simply another colonial regulation. To Hong, it was an attack on his way of life. Furious, he joined the Righteous Army movement that emerged in 1907. These volunteer militias carried out attacks against Japanese forces even as Korea's sovereignty continued to disappear. When annexation became inevitable, Hong crossed into Manchuria, where thousands of Korean exiles were gathering to continue the struggle. There, he helped train new recruits and eventually rose to become commander-in-chief of the Korean Independence Army. Unlike many leaders, Hong understood how to survive in difficult terrain. He used the mountains and forests to his advantage, launching surprise attacks against Japanese troops and disappearing before they could retaliate. His greatest victory came in 1920. Determined to crush the resistance, Japanese forces crossed into Manchuria in pursuit of Korean fighters. Near Bong-gil Valley, Hong prepared an ambush. As Japanese soldiers advanced deeper into the valley, Korean forces attacked from concealed positions. The battle quickly turned into a disaster for Japan. When the fighting ended, Korean independence fighters had achieved one of their most important victories against the Japanese military. News of the Battle of Bong-gil spread rapidly. For Koreans living under colonial rule, it was proof that resistance was still possible. But success came at a cost. Later that same year, further fighting erupted at Cheongsan-ri. As Japanese pressure increased, many Korean fighters retreated deeper into Manchuria and eventually into Soviet territory. There, a new challenge emerged. The Soviet government feared provoking Japan and demanded that Korean independence forces surrender their weapons. Hong resisted. Eventually, he found himself serving alongside the Soviet Red Army, a far cry from the mountains where his journey had begun. Years later, under Joseph Stalin's policies, hundreds of thousands of ethnic Koreans were forcibly relocated to Central Asia. Hong Beom-do was among them. The man who had spent his life fighting for Korea died in Kazakhstan, thousands of kilometers from the homeland he had fought so hard to free. He would never return. Many of Korea's independence fighters were soldiers. Gwan-sun was a student. Born in 1902, she grew up in a Protestant family that valued education. Bright and determined, she eventually enrolled at Iwahakdang, one of Korea's most prestigious schools for women. But her studies would soon be interrupted by history. On March 1, 1919, Korea erupted. Across the country, millions of Koreans participated in peaceful demonstrations demanding independence from Japan. The movement became known as the March 1st movement and remains one of the most important moments in modern Korean history. Yu was only 16 years old, yet she immediately joined the protests. On March 5th, she participated in large demonstrations in Seoul and witnessed firsthand the determination and brutality that defined the movement. Japanese authorities responded with arrests and force. Although Yu was initially released, she refused to stop. Returning to her hometown near Cheonan, she began organizing new demonstrations and encouraging neighboring communities to join the independence movement. Her efforts culminated in a massive gathering of roughly 3,000 people. They carried Korean flags, they shouted for independence, and the Japanese forces arrived. Without warning, soldiers opened fire on the crowd. 19 people were killed. Among the dead were Yu Gwan-sun's parents. Yu herself was arrested. Even during her trial, she remained defiant. She openly challenged the legitimacy of the colonial justice system and demanded fair treatment. The court was unmoved. She was sentenced to prison and transferred to the notorious Seodaemun prison in Seoul. Most prisoners hoped for release. Yu focused on resistance. Despite repeated beatings and torture, she continued advocating for independence. In 1920, while still imprisoned, she helped organize another demonstration involving thousands of inmates. The authorities responded with even greater brutality. She was isolated, tortured, and subjected to harsh punishment. Yet she refused to abandon her beliefs. Eventually, her sentence was reduced as part of a royal commemoration connected to the marriage of Crown Prince Yi-eun. It no longer mattered. The injuries she had suffered were too severe. On September 28, 1920, Gwan-sun died in prison. She was 18 years old. Before her death, she wrote, "Japan will fall. Even if my fingernails are torn out, my nose and ears are ripped apart, and my legs and arms are crushed, this physical pain does not compare to the pain of losing my nation. My only remorse is not being able to do more than dedicating my life to my country." She never saw Korea become free, but her courage transformed her into one of the most enduring symbols of Korean resistance. For generations of Koreans, Gwan-sun became proof that patriotism was not measured by age, wealth, or status, only by conviction. The story of Korean independence was never the story of a single hero. It was the story of countless individuals who refused to accept that their nation had disappeared. Jung-geun believed that striking down one of the architects of Japanese rule could awaken the world to Korea's plight. Bong-gil carried the fight beyond Korea's borders and demonstrated that the independence movement was still alive, even decades after annexation. Jajin proved that Korean forces could stand against a larger and more powerful enemy on the battlefield. Beom-do transformed from a hunter into one of the most successful guerrilla commanders of the independence movement. And Gwan-sun, still a teenager, showed that courage does not depend on age, rank, or military strength. All of them shared the same belief, that Korea deserved to be free. When Japan annexed Korea in 1910, many believed Korean independence had become impossible. The empire had fallen. The government had been dismantled. Resistance seemed hopeless. But for the next 35 years, independence fighters continued their struggle. Many would never live to see the outcome of their sacrifices. Yet on August 15, 1945, after Japan's surrender in World War II, Korea finally regained its independence. The road to liberation had been long, painful, and costly. And while no single individual can claim responsibility for Korea's freedom, the sacrifices of independence activists helped ensure that the dream of an independent Korea never disappeared. Today, their names can be found in textbooks, museums, monuments, and memorials throughout Korea. But perhaps their greatest legacy is something less visible. They preserve the belief that a nation is more than a government, a border, or an army. A nation is its people. And as long as people are willing to fight for their identity, culture, and freedom, that nation can endure even in the darkest periods of its history. More than a century later, Korea continues to remember those who sacrificed everything for their independence. Because their story is not just about the past. It is a reminder that even when a nation loses its sovereignty, it does not have to lose its spirit. And for that reason, Korea will never forget them. If you like this video, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more videos just like this.